Hello, my name is Amanda Connor. I am with the law firm of Connor and Connor. We're a law firm based in Las Vegas, Nevada, and we work primarily in the area of cannabis law. In Nevada, it's regulated cannabis with licensed cannabis cultivations, productions, and dispensaries. And we work with our clients on obtaining those licenses and then keeping in compliance while operating those businesses.
Hey, I'm Morgan Davis. I'm an owner of Davis Legal, founder of the boutique cannabis law firm based in Raleigh, North Carolina. In North Carolina, currently, it's mostly hemp businesses. We do have medical cannabis coming online soon, hopefully. And we spend, yeah, we spend most of our time helping our clients pick the right product that gets them into as many jurisdictions as possible with as few hurdles as possible.
Yeah. And today, kind of connecting with what you do, Morgan, we're talking about the Farm Bill, which at the federal level legalized hemp so that many states, even if they don't have a regulated cannabis market yet, they can get cannabis products out to their consumers.
hmm Yeah, it's so interesting. The 2018 Farm Bill is what we've been operating under for the past 5 years and or 6 years now, and it in very short order opened this massive market that we now have, and now we're seeing a combination of reactions in the drafting of the Farm Bill. And everybody's got a prediction, right? Everybody's got their crystal ball as to what they think is going to happen, which I try not to do because there's really no telling these days which way the wind will blow.
I agree. I don't think we can predict exactly what will happen. But when you mentioned massive market, I think I was kind of astounded by the numbers that the hemp industry quickly surpassed the regulated cannabis industry and is a multi-billion dollar industry. But it makes sense because every state theoretically can have hemp while cannabis is, regulated cannabis is only in the states that have legalized it. And federally, it's still federally illegal.
Yeah, and that's the interesting part, right? So when 2018 happened and we saw hemp come online, at first it was everybody thinking, well, we're just gonna grow hemp for, I don't know, materials, but then CBD immediately was everywhere. Um, And now we've transitioned from the sort of health and wellness CBD focused products into a much bigger focus on intoxicating hemp products, or depending on who you talk to, it's all cannabis anyway, is an often remark that you hear these days, which is true. Um, Especially if you look at the legal definition, it's all cannabis. But to your point, I think the reason for that is there's a desire for these products. There's a need, a desire. And so hemp, especially the intoxicating hemp market at the moment, fills that need in places where regulated cannabis isn't readily available, whether it's recreationally or medically. So like in a state like North Carolina, where I'm based, hemp is everywhere and it's huge and everybody loves it, and there's very little difference in the experience, anecdotally, of course, between those who use regulated cannabis and those who use intoxicating hemp products, depending on the quality of the product.
Correct. You said it. There's a need, there's a demand, right? And so across the states that don't have recreational or regulated cannabis, the hemp has filled in that market. I think there becomes in states like Nevada, there's a lot of friction
Mm,
because we have a regulated cannabis market. It's very expensive to run that regulated cannabis market, and the intoxicating hemp products come in and compete. They're direct competitors, right, with the regulated market, and they don't have the same restrictions and barriers. At least that's what the regulated cannabis industry here argues, is it's easier for the intoxicating hemp. They can cross state lines. They can,
mhm,
they fill a bigger branding because they can have it across the country. They don't have the same licensing fees and tax uh, implications at the state level. So
Hmm.
there is that friction, especially in the states with regulated cannabis, where intoxicating hemp comes in. It feels like a direct competitor that's not on the same playing field.
Well, and would you agree? I would say that the regulatory bodies who've been tasked with regulating cannabis, whether it's adult use or medical, are much better developed and involved as opposed to the regulating agencies that have been tasked with regulating hemp. I just feel like they're
I
so much more developed.
I completely agree with that statement. I think the regulating bodies over regulated cannabis are in most states. Obviously, we have states still coming online and they're figuring things out. But in most states where there's regulated cannabis, those bodies are well developed. They have high regulations, right? Nevada prides itself on how strict and um, rigid the regulations are for regulated
Mhm.
cannabis. And a lot of states, Colorado has a very well developed body of regulations for regulated cannabis, as an example. And yet the bodies that oversee hemp are not as well developed. In Nevada, it's the Department of Agriculture charged with overseeing the hemp program, and the regulations are minimal. I mean, there are some, but they're much less in comparison to what the regulated cannabis industry faces.
Mhm. And it's so you guys deal with a very siloed business model, right? Where you have multi-state operators who are in lots of different states, but they almost run a business based on the state they're in, right? They have an entity that's specific to that state. They might have a parent company, but every entity within that state runs its own business and has to have its own operation, sometimes completely vertically integrated. Whereas hemp, you can almost run like any other national business, especially you can use e-commerce, you can use direct to consumer, you could use distribution models. It's very different. That being said, states, because the federal government hasn't developed a regulatory structure for hemp, states have taken on the tasks themselves. And the sort of push pull that's been created, I think, somewhat between the friction of regulated cannabis and hemp, which they often refer to as like the civil war between cannabis and hemp, which is so funny to me. Or what did I hear somebody refer to it the other day as the cream puff war? I don't understand that, but
Yeah, I don't understand that.
that's what I've read. It's been called now. So there's that friction which has created one like certain legislative trends, and then there's the friction of states dealing with the fact that they don't have a developed regulating body, so they either try and ban everything or they try and ban certain things that they're getting the information is worse than others. And it's now created very much a patchwork quilt of regulations that if you're trying to have a hemp product in all 50 states, you simply can't, not without having multiple different formulations.
Almost like the hemp industry is now having to act somewhat like the regulated cannabis in that you have to design and address each state's individual restrictions.
Mm-hmm.
Because you are right, for regulated cannabis, it's almost, even though they have a parent company and they would like to have, you know, seamless operations across their various states that they're in, they have to create businesses within a business to address the restrictions within each state. And I think hemp is now seeing that as an issue for them as well. You have some states that don't want intoxicating hemp. You kind of mentioned that, and they're trying to ban it or
Mm-hmm.
ban certain products. You have other states that don't have a well developed regulated body. They're trying to catch up. So yeah, I think it's an interesting time to see how how the industry develops to hit those different markets and those different restrictions.
Yeah, interesting time you're exactly right. I mean, so 2023, 2024 Farm Bill, which is now being debated, um, and from what I'm hearing, won't pass this year. They'll wait through the election cycle and maybe pass it next year. We'll see. Um, this entire election is nuts anyway. But to focus
Yes.
on the hemp market or cannabis market, you're seeing that start to play out in like what we're talking about at the state level. These tensions play out at the national level. So we had the Mary Miller Amendment come out in committee, which is still there. Is has not been pulled back, though I know there are plenty of lobbying groups who are trying to get it pulled back. And that amendment essentially completely gets rid of intoxicating hemp. It says anything with THC at any level becomes illegal, right? It becomes illegal at the federal level. And I'm not quite clear if they're going to consider it then. Will it be rescheduled with cannabis when cannabis is rescheduled from Schedule 1 to Schedule 3? Will it depend on what the type of THC is? Will it depend on how it's made? I think there's so many questions that aren't answered by that amendment.
That's just what I was going to say, is I think the Mary Miller Amendment is doesn't go far as answering all the questions, right? Does it tie, if it's going to ban it, does it then tie it to cannabis? And if cannabis is rescheduled, does then the intoxicating hemp also get rescheduled? I don't think we know those answers. I also am hearing like you that we're probably not going to see action on this Farm Bill Act this year. But I think these tensions are going to continue to be there. So we're going to continue to have these discussions, and it does become a question of what are they going to do at the federal level, and how are we going to address it, and how then does both industries, regulated cannabis and hemp, adapt to what happens.
And I think if you have to take it's just an interesting timeline of events. So the 2024 Farm Bill starts being debated. The Mary Miller Amendment comes out. I think the same week or the week before, within 10 days, the DEA issues a letter in response to an attorney asking about THCA, saying that at the federal level, THCA flower is basically illegal and that everything has to be taken under a total THC limitation, right? Same time, the DEA issues its rescheduling memo, and it has some very weird stuff in there about how synthetic cannabinoids aren't going to leave Schedule 1. They're going to stay as Schedule 1. And so is that them nodding their head towards Delta 8 and Delta 10 and all of these other semi-synthetic synthetics? The definitions are so blurry at this point that that's how they're gonna handle that issue. Like, we're just gonna leave them as synthetic cannabinoids. They stay as Schedule 1 and federally illegal. And it all seems to be happening at the same time
Yeah.
when we've seen
That,
so little action at the federal level for so long.
for so long, nothing was really occurring, right? And then all of a sudden it was, you're right, this like window of time where all these different things started happening. And I think it just raises more questions. It leaves, we're unsure where things are going. And we have so many questions about, well, what are you going to do? And I think, let's touch on synthetic cannabinoids. In Nevada and several other states,
Mm-hmm.
they've banned synthetic cannabinoids. But that doesn't, I don't think, necessarily touch on things like Delta 8, Delta 10, if they're not completely synthetically derived, right? If
Right.
they're hemp
Right.
based. Um, but I think that kind of gray area, or whatever you want to call it, needs to be addressed as well. and it's unclear. At the federal level, are they, they said we're going to leave synthetic cannabinoids or they're different. Well, what about these others that are more hemp derived, right?
Well, and Nevada prides itself on being one of the first states to come up with a definition of synthetic cannabinoid that was very much based in what historically the DEA's definition is, where it's a synthetic process. You're creating a synthetic chemical that is not based in the plant, right? But you're right, Delta 8, Delta 10, not even just the intoxicating ones, many of the minor cannabinoids have to be extracted in a semi synthetic fashion because it's just not commercially viable to extract them in a wholly natural fashion.
Correct.
And that's not something that historically we as consumers have really had an issue with. I mean, the pharmaceutical industry, the cosmetic industry, lots of industries make all sorts of ingredients that we ingest every day semi synthetically or
That
synthetically. Yeah.
it's even hit the regulated cannabis industry because in some of their products, they take these minor cannabinoids and will add them back in, right? Or
Mm-hmm.
use them from hemp and add them into their products. And in Nevada, because of their basis of their definition, they're not allowing those
Mm-hmm.
anymore. And it's affected even the regulated cannabis industry in a way that no one anticipated or suspected because I don't think we thought about these kind of semi synthetics or whatever you want to call them being banned by the ban of synthetically derived cannabinoids. But the Cannabis Compliance Board has taken that position that even semi synthetic, even though they're naturally occurring, if there's a process to extract them that's somehow synthetic or chemical based, then they're not allowed in.
Yeah, and that's really tough as a business. I mean, you are like talking about the different legislative trends. So that's one way that I've seen this sort of civil war play out, as you've seen the regulated cannabis industry adopt this, we're going to ban synthetics. And so they're pushing for legislation and lobbying for legislation that bans synthetics. And their aim is products like Delta 8 products, Delta 10 products, HHC, THCO, and some of that I think is easy to deal with. If it doesn't occur naturally in the plant, then
Right.
clearly that's you put that in one category. Some of the others, like Delta 8 specifically, does naturally occur, CBN, CBG, THCV, though I know there's controversy around THCV and the studies behind that. But let's say that's we all agree that it naturally occurs. You see some states that are like, well, we're going to specifically list those cannabinoids that we want to ban. Okay, well, that's easier for a business to deal with. But then when you look at differing state definitions, like this definition of synthetic in Nevada versus the definition of synthetic in California, I mean, unless you've got a biology degree or a chemistry degree, I don't know how business owners are supposed to easily navigate developing a product based on these
Right.
crazy different definitions.
And I have to wonder, the legislators who passed those, did they really know what they were banning or not banning? Right?
Probably
Because
not.
they
There's no
they
way.
probably don't have the scientific degree or understanding to know exactly what they were banning either. I think they were faced with a problem or a challenge and just adopted some language. And I'm not sure. The question becomes, even going back to the Mary Miller Amendment, do these legislative actions actually address the issue they're trying to solve for? Whatever that is.
Yeah, and I think the way we see it play out most of the time is that they don't, right? They address maybe a fraction of it. They're either too light-handed sometimes or they're too heavy-handed.
Yeah.
Um, and what we're also seeing play out is when it's too heavy-handed and you're in a state with a well-developed hemp industry, sometimes judicial action will be successful to prevent the state from moving forward, like in Arkansas and Maryland. Sometimes it's not like in Alaska. Um, and then, or in Florida, we see where, well, Florida wasn't judicial action. Ultimately, the governor vetoed that recent bill, but he did so based on my understanding, like a lot of political pressure being you're going to destroy a multi-million dollar
Million
industry in
dollar. Yeah.
Florida. You're
Yeah.
going to put a lot of people out of business. So, is the cat too far out of the bag for all this ban language and this Mary Miller amendment? That's what I'm hearing is it's a play, it's a political play. It's not going to stick, and everybody knows that we're too far gone at this point to try and walk back, you know, uh, to a total THC ban across the United States.
Yeah,
Um,
I was going to say it's much like regulated cannabis, right? Where even though federally it's still a Schedule One drug, we're way too far gone to completely get rid of regulated cannabis, even if the federal government wanted to start enforcing. Similar concept, I think.
yeah.
Hemp is the industry has been being developed. I mean, we're 6 years in to this Farm Bill Act, right? I know 6 years doesn't seem like a lot of time, but it's a multi-billion-dollar industry. Now, all of it's not um, intoxicating hemp, but that does
Right.
play a significant portion
Yeah.
of these businesses, and not only are you getting rid of business and revenue, it's how many people's jobs are these
Hmm.
states or the federal government costing if they do a complete ban?
Absolutely. So then that leads to the question of, okay, so we're too far gone. What do we do instead? Right? What does the federal government do instead? Do they keep going down the road of, we'll let the states handle it? Or do they try? I mean, their attempts to force the FDA to actually come to the table and do its job in regulating this industry has gone nowhere.
Nowhere. Yeah.
I mean, the FDA is essentially like talk about the tension between two. Congress says, FDA, do your job. FDA says, well, we can't do our job, Congress. You need to do our job for us. Congress says, we're mad at you, FDA, for not doing your job. FDA goes, I can't do my job. I don't have the resources. And I just wonder how long that's going to go on. Like this tossing back and forth of this chew toy.
Yeah, I don't know what the answer is. I've heard some people speculate that at some point regulated cannabis and hemp will merge and be
Mm,
regulated, together at the federal level. But I think you also have to have an agency at the federal government that's going to want to take that on, right? It's a huge thing to take on, especially these industries that are well developed and start imposing federal regulations
hmm
onto them, right? California tried to do that at the state level. Their cannabis program
hmm
had been run for years and years, and it was really hard to then come in and try and regulate. I think the same thing when the federal government finally decides, if they do, to step in, it's going to be a huge challenge to have these businesses now suddenly conform to whatever regulatory structure they put in place.
Yeah, it's interesting. A lot of people, everybody likes to speculate who would the right agency be. And, the DEA is not going to regulate them. They'll just essentially decide what's legal and what's not. And then it becomes either the job of the FDA or it could become the job of something that was a popular idea maybe a year ago was the TTB, right? So we treat it like alcohol. And they do what they do at the level national level, and then all of the states ALEs or ABC or whatever their state version of the TTB is regulates at the state level. I always liked that idea. I thought it made sense, especially for intoxicating hemp products or for regulated cannabis. You're treating it the way that it should be treated, unless you're talking about medical grade or dietary supplements. Um, and to me, that doesn't seem like a hard. I guess you could argue, well, what's the cutoff point for a dietary supplement hemp product versus an intoxicating hemp product? And everybody's got a different opinion about that. But, um, you know, I always thought that that was a decent path forward, but it
Yeah,
never seemed to gain any traction.
no, I also agree with you. When that was being discussed, I thought that was a great path forward, um, for both regulated cannabis and intoxicating hemp, kind of the recreational market. Medical grade and dietary supplements aside, I thought that made the most sense. We already have a federal agency. Most of the states, all of the states have a corresponding state agency.
Hmm.
And you could, in states that have already developed their own regulatory body for cannabis, such as Nevada, California, those, they could leave it there, right? They don't have to move it. But I thought that made the most sense. Treat it like alcohol, right?
Hmm.
Another intoxicating substance that it can be used for recreational purpose. Um, but it didn't seem to gain a lot of traction. I personally don't think the FDA wants to get involved, right? There's a reason they haven't acted on hemp, and it's not because they need more direction. It's they don't want to get involved.
Yeah, and I do believe them. They don't have the resources. I mean, look at the whole vape issue. They have they banned. Well, they didn't ban. They made it clear that all nicotine vapes were going to be subject to the same approval process that regular nicotine cigarettes and other products back in what, like 2009, like
Yeah.
a long time ago. And they're just now enforcing that and just now starting to like go after people who are selling unapproved vapor products,
Yeah.
which talk about the cat being out of the bag. I mean,
That is for sure. And I do agree. They don't have the resources. And the hemp industry and regulated cannabis is a huge industry to then come in and regulate, right? They would need a lot of resources to enforce those regulations.
so what are you telling? So I'm sure that you get calls all the time like, when do I need to start worrying about the farm bill? Is it going to pass this year? Is my business still going to exist? Um, I get those calls, every time something in the news media pops up about the farm bill. What are you telling your clients in terms of preparation for the next 12 to 18 months?
Oh. So I get kind of calls on both sides, right?
Hmm.
Because we also have hemp clients out here in Nevada, but mainly my side does regulated cannabis. My husband, my law partner, does more of the hemp. But the regulated cannabis calls and says, is this going to pass, or should I figure out how, because they're looking at competition, right?
Hmm.
Is my competition going to go down, or do I need to start planning ahead for continuing to compete with intoxicating hemp? And then the hemp client saying what to do. It's a hard, I tell them I plan for both, right? We don't know for sure. The word on the street now is that it's probably not going to pass this year, but I think as a good business person, you need to be prepared for whatever may happen, right?
Yep.
And so that's kind of my advice to my clients.
I,
What do you
I,
tell yours?
I mean, very similar. I don't think you'll be worried about a federal ban ever, probably, but if it's going to happen, if something's going to change significantly, it's probably going to change next year, not this year. And there's so many regulations to be worried about at the state level right now, depending on where you're selling your products. I tell them to focus on that. Because the other thing is, you know, what are you, unless you've got a lobbying team and a lot of money out there, what are you going to be able to do as a state or even regional business in hemp or cannabis, right? You join, I mean, I tell them all the time, find a trade group, find an advocacy group that's aligned with you and what you're looking for, and join and make sure that your voice is heard, right?
Yeah,
do so at both the federal and the state level. Like there's a there's been a lot of um, in the hemp industry because it was so unregulated for so long, because it was such a wild west. There was a lack of participation in advocacy and lobbying by a lot of businesses. Still, there still is. But I'd say in the last 12 months, the industry's really gotten its act together and is doing a lot more advocating for itself, um, which is so important. It's so important. And so I tell them to do that. And then otherwise, I tell them, focus on your own backyard for right now. Because
for
especially depending on where you are, that may change a lot faster than the federal level.
for sure. And I think, on the regulated cannabis side, they're aware of that. We've been living this, they are much more developed in advocacy. Almost all of my clients are a part of various advocacy groups or even have their own lobbyists on within their company. And that's just been a part of the regulated cannabis industry for a
Yeah.
long time.
Yep.
And they are aware that the states change their laws a lot quicker and their regulations than the federal government does. Um, so same thing, telling both clients, I agree with you. Hemp was not really into the advocacy thing. Portion, I believe in the last like 12 months, I've seen a lot more groups popping up and
Mm-hmm.
people becoming a part of it. I don't think they felt the need for it before then.
Mm-hmm.
Um, right. So I think that being a part of a group, making sure your voice is heard is very important on whatever side of the coin you end up on this issue. Um, but I agree. Looking at the states, I think are going to be probably more important right now. We're probably not going to see this 2024 Farm Bill Act and a complete ban go forward this year. But I do think some states may take some action this year.
Mm-hmm. Well, we've already seen some of that happen. New Jersey, they actually passed it's not a ban, but the milligram limitations are very, very low. We'll see if the governor actually signs it or not. That just went through last month, right?
Yeah.
Um, Connecticut, Connecticut's crazy. I mean, I think they've changed their milligram caps like 3 times in the last 12 months. But again, very low. Um, so many other states. Louisiana just changed theirs again. They attempted almost a total ban. That didn't pass. I think they got it down to 5 milligrams, 5 and 40.
Hmm.
Um, Iowa just passed a 4 and 10 milligram cap. Uh, California's got pending legislation that would almost be a total ban for the hemp industry. Illinois tried to do it, wasn't successful. I hear they're going to try again in the fall. So, yeah, I agree with you. I mean, I think it's a wild time um, to try and keep up. And I feel for my hemp clients, that's the other big differentiating factor. Like regulated cannabis operators often, because they have very large teams, right? They've got in-house compliance or they've got money to pay out of house compliance. They've got quality assurance. They have lobbyists. They have a lot more employees under their own umbrella for resources to stay on top of this stuff. And hemp companies, I mean, some of even the most successful ones are their teams aren't bigger than 15 people.
Correct. They're very small companies for the size of business that they do. In comparison,
Mm-hmm.
I feel like regulated cannabis have extremely large teams for their business. Most of my clients are have in-house compliance teams plus out you know contracted compliance attorneys in almost every state they run, if not every state, plus lobbyists in-house and state lobbyists. Some have federal lobbyists as well. So it's a huge team in comparison. And I feel like the the hemp businesses are just as big, if not bigger, with a much, much smaller team.
Yeah.
So, but I was going to say the same thing. I don't know how they keep up with all the changes. Regulated cannabis faces the same. The states change their laws and regulations constantly, so they're constantly having to adapt. But for hemp, they're, selling to mini markets and have a much smaller team, so they have to be on top of it because these laws are changing constantly on what they can and can't do.
Well, and that's where I think, there's another differentiator. Like your clients in the regulated cannabis space have agencies that are on top of them. And so if they step out of line, it's likely somebody's going to call them out on it. Whereas in the hemp space, much to what you said earlier, there's been no pressure for years. There's been no consequence to not following a regulation because there's not enough enforcement. And as that's changing, watching that mentality change is very interesting. I mean, for years, it was hard to convince my clients to take a responsible labeling, position when it wasn't required under the law because they were like, I'm not worried that anybody's going to enforce this against me. Nobody's enforcing anything. Why should I care?
Yeah.
And now, on a state by state level, you're seeing not just regulating bodies, but actual law enforcement, actual criminal charges being brought against business owners in the hemp space. And I think that's like I don't know that regulated cannabis is as worried anymore about the criminal offense, right? They're much more worried about losing their very expensive licenses that they've
Yes.
paid a lot of money for. They're not so much worried about like the local sheriff showing up at their grow, um, but hemp is and should be because it's definitely happening.
Yeah. Yeah. I will say, back in 2013, when we were getting involved in this, the
Hmm.
law enforcement aspect was something people talked about, were worried about. There were, raids in California, Colorado, all over happening. So it was something you worried about. Now that's not a talk in the regulated cannabis industry. I mean, it is still theoretically a possibility, but it doesn't really happen. The risk is losing your license, right? And
Yeah.
there is enforcement right away if you step out of line, and competitors or others who will make sure the regulated agencies are aware of it. Whereas I think hemp is just now starting to experience that, right? They're having law
Hmm.
enforcement. The agencies are starting to become developed at the state levels. Like we talked about in the beginning, I don't think they're as well developed yet for hemp, but I think they're going to get there, and they'll have that enforcement as well.
Yeah, it's a really fascinating time to be a lawyer in this space, no matter which side of it you're on, and to watch it play out, to see, will there be sort of a meeting in the middle where regulated cannabis comes more this way and hemp comes more this way, and we end up in some sort of meld between the industries? Or do we continue to see them sort of battle it out in places where they coexist, and then hemp gets to exist in places that haven't embraced regulated cannabis? Um, it's yeah, who knows where we're going to be 18 to 24 months from now?
Yeah, I'm excited. It's an exciting time. I love
Yeah,
what I do because it's kind of unknown and we're experiencing changes, right? I'm not doing the same thing day in and day out,
yeah,
but who knows where we're going to be in a year or 2 years from now.
yeah. I couldn't agree more. I think it's a super exciting industry. And you have to admire the innovation, right? The constant pivoting and the changes, I think, creates an incredible amount of innovation inside of what is truly one plant. And
Yeah.
we've watched two, three, four industries that exist under this larger umbrella really take it and run in so many different directions. Um,
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I do not have the creative. capabilities, but all of the products and different business models and things we've seen come out of it are just amazing, right? And
Yeah.
how they can pivot and adapt to this changing legal landscape is really impressive.
I know as lawyers, we don't have to do that all that often. Um, and it's like I'm glad that I don't have to do that all that often because I'm not sure that I'm built that way. But I love to assist those who can and do and sort of be there to, you know, watch from the sidelines.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, it was great getting to chat with you.
You too. This was fun.